Hello, mate to Thrive Nation. This is number 3 in our take with Greg Schmaus, a health hero all the way from the US. We've had load shedding stage 6 today. The generator is running and our bandwidth is a problem. So we are starting again, but it's a real privilege to have you on the show, Greg.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
This is your third introduction here, but I really appreciate your patience. You're a man who I can see just speaks from the heart and has got a beautiful soul. So give a backstory a little bit. You're an energy healer, shamanic energy healer, holistic health practitioner, just a little bit about mental ill health and emotional ill health, and I think we want to dive into.
Yeah, so like you were sharing earlier, just the term health hero really kind of touched me because my work as a holistic health practitioner is really an expression of my own healing journey, which for me started back when I was in college and was competing athletically. I was playing college golf. And after a surgery and some trauma, I started experiencing a lot of anxiety, OCD, insomnia, a lot of gut issues. So just mind and body was kind of breaking down. And, you know, my initial dream of playing professional golf, I started to kind of move away from that because I was really devoting my time to my own healing and ended up leaving school and moving away from my golf career and really dove into, everything mental health, gut health, holistic health. And Paul Chek ended up being my first teacher and mentor that really kind of like guided me on that journey, which is what brought me to the Chek Institute, where I've been studying with them for about 9 years and, studying under Paul and, his work. But, my healing journey has really shown me that health is not something you learn in a classroom. It's not something you learn taking a certification course. It's something you learn engaging your own life.
Yeah.
And really choosing to participate in your life fully and paying attention to what life is telling you, what life is showing you, what life is teaching you. And your own body is constantly mirroring back to you your own life choices. And so although I think all the Chek Institute is great, all the certification training programs, all of the education, the books, all of it is fantastic. If you just choose to participate in life, you're going to gather so much knowledge and wisdom that, that's really the foundation of, where I come from and where I operate from and where I speak from.
Brilliant. And I've been in practice now for 24 years, Greg, as a functional medicine expert, doctor of Chinese medicine and acupuncture. Loved the podcast for the last 3 years. But like I say to many of my colleagues, there's been so much emotional vomit that's really come from a lot of patients and clients this year. It's been a very difficult year in South Africa and beyond, and people do not have the emotional reserve or capacity. And how to sort of develop sort of mental capacity and emotional health?
So in relationship to everything that's going on now and why the mental emotional piece is so important and so challenging is I think there's a few reasons. Number one, I would say that our collective nervous system is in this constant sympathetic fight or flight response. I think with all of the overstimulation, with the way in which we're kind of engaging life with how much work we're expected to do, how little we're resting, how poor our sleep quality is, our food quality, how much time we're spending indoors on screens and not outdoors in nature. I think our whole nervous system is really in that stress response, kind of like 24/7. It's almost like stuck in that sympathetic state. And obviously, when we're in that state, we're in survival mode. That nervous system is still very primal. It's still, it still thinks we're hunters and gatherers running from lions and tigers and bears. So I think anytime we shift into that survival reflex, that sympathetic state, we go into that default mode network, which is kind of that part of the brain that's like, do what you've always done, think what you've always thought, because it's kept you alive until now. So we do what allows us to survive, but not necessarily thrive. And I just see like on the screen here, Made to Thrive being like obviously the name of your podcast. And I think the prerequisite to thriving is moving out of survival mode. So I think the first thing is we have to rebalance the nervous system, because anytime we're in that fight or flight state, it's very hard to make a different choice. It's very hard to process something that's uncomfortable. It's very hard to sit with your emotions and really be present with things when you're in that fight or flight state. So I think the nervous system is the first thing. And the second thing is we have so many more ways to distract ourselves, and we have so many more mechanisms to check out when things rise up in us. So, 100 years ago, if we had a challenging day and some stressful emotions that would come up, we would like sit by the fire with our family and like talk it through. And now we sit on the couch and watch Netflix. So there's not as much processing, there's not as much connecting to the parts of ourselves that are under stress. There's really more of an avoidance mechanism. There's many, many ways to check out or numb out. So that's, I would say, the second thing. The third thing I would say is our bodies are getting very unhealthy. Our bodies are very inflamed. And I'm just speaking generally, collectively. Our bodies are quite infected and with just chronic infections. And because our gut health is poor, our immune systems are not functioning optimally. And there's a lot of toxicity. And I think when the body gets out of balance, the mind follows. The mind and the brain are only as healthy as the body that it's living in. So if the body becomes toxic, infected, inflamed, then the mind does too. And it's much harder to feel and process emotions when the body's unhealthy, because your emotions are felt in your body. But if your body's inflamed from, a leaky gut and food intolerances and heavy metals and things like that, which from all your functional medicine work, it's much harder to stay in your body and process things and feel things and be present with things. So I would say those are the top three things that come to mind. Would be the nervous system, the easy ability to check out and numb out with so many more distractions than we've ever had. And number three would be the poor health of the body, and that making it a lot harder to be in yourself and process things inside of you.
Brilliant. And I think that was very well articulated. I want to jump into possibly just emotional health. I think the disconnection of us as human beings, the disconnection of ourselves. I'm having Zach Bush at the end of the month on the show talking about cells and cancer, how these cells go out of control because they are disconnected to the rest of the cellular network, the matrix. I think it's the same with human beings. It's never been a time, I think, that we're so disconnected. Good or great friends have decreased significantly. I know there's some studies in the US that from the 80s, the average American used to have 3 really good friends. I think it's down to 1.5 now. So talk about emotional health, being sort of self-aware, self-regulating, social awareness in your relationships, and just the disconnection that's happening, because that would be probably one of the pillars that you would start with regards to someone's health and mental health and emotional health.
Yeah, I don't think you can separate mental health and emotional health. And, one of my favorite quotes is from Carl Jung, who said, "All mental illness is the avoidance of a deeper suffering." And what that means is all illness of the mind is a way in which we try and avoid some other pain, some other discomfort. And that usually happens on an emotional level. So if you see thinking as the language of the mind and feeling as the language of the body, thoughts are in the mind, emotions are in the body. So a lot of times we use the mind to avoid the body. We use thinking to avoid feeling. So a lot of times people come to me and say, I'm feeling so much anxiety. And I'll ask them, okay, but what if anxiety is not a feeling? What if anxiety is the avoidance of feeling? Because usually the experience of anxiety, for example, is kind of like the attempt to try and avoid something. the attempt to try and bypass something, or the attempt to try and almost like escape yourself. So all mental health or mental illness, you could say, is the avoidance of some emotion, some grief, some anger, some shame, some fear, something that we don't want to feel will retreat into the mind and almost use mental activity as a way of almost like discharging that energy. We've all heard the term emotion as energy in motion. And when you're feeling your emotions, the energy is in motion. It's being processed. It's being digested, just like food moves through your digestive system. But as soon as we start disconnecting from our emotions, suppressing our emotions, and not feeling our emotions, remember, energy can't be created nor destroyed, only transferred. So that energy has to go somewhere. And it usually goes through the mind, almost like when you shake a soda bottle up, the pressure builds and eventually you pull the cap off and there's a release valve. Mental illness is kind of like the release valve that's a result of the built-up pressure of the emotions that we weren't feeling and processing. And all of that goes back to, the body's unhealthy, the nervous system's overstimulated, but also we're not really taught how to be present with emotions without trying to fix them. We've all been kind of like taught this idea that there's good emotions and there's bad emotions. And you should feel the good emotions and you should avoid the bad emotions. But that creates this pattern and this mechanism of attaching to one polarity and avoiding the other polarity, which creates a lot of suffering. But if you can start to see all emotions as energy moving through your body and drop the label and drop the story and drop the narrative that you've attached to it, and you just come back to the energetic expression of the emotion in your physical body, then it allows you to be present with things without having to fix it. And I think that's really one of the most important steps in emotional health and emotional intelligence, is learning how to be present with something without needing to always do something about it. Can you be present with your anger or present with your shame or present with your grief, but not feel like you have to fix it in any way? Because usually the fixing it is our way of trying to wiggle our way out of it. So I think
times it's like you got this hedonic lifestyle where you've got to have pleasure and you've got to feel happy. You've got to have this dopamine hits it. You've got to have serotonin going through, and you've got to have all these wonderful neurotransmitters so that you can feel good. But as soon as you're not feeling good, you want to resist those or suppress those. So now what you're saying is you've got to become mindful of those and aware of those and just sort of sit with them.
Yeah, I think what you can witness and observe and be present with without judgment of right or wrong or good or bad, that thing starts to heal immediately. When you bring present awareness without judgment to whatever that is inside of you, you can be fully present with it. I think that's what begins to heal. Like, for example, before we got on the podcast, whenever I do podcasts beforehand, my heart pounds 1,000,000 miles an hour. My throat starts to lock up, tremendous like fear and anxiety. And I just sit presently with that energy. And I just bring my awareness into that part of my body. And I almost imagine it like one of my little children who's scared. And I just hold space with it. I'm present with it. I just let that energy know that I'm here. Because in reality, that energy is just an expression of my wounded child. It's an expression of my invisible child that, was always quiet and introverted and was bullied for never speaking and has a hard time expressing himself. So you go into a podcast and that becomes very fearful, very vulnerable for that part of me. But if I was just trying to fix that part of me, it would be like a parent just trying to fix the child without really being present with it, without holding space for it. So a lot of the emotional intelligence and emotional health really comes back to how we parent ourselves, how we hold space for ourselves, how we bring presence to ourselves without trying to fix ourselves. And I think that's really the key. And what you realize is the challenging ways or the stressful ways in which we engage our emotions usually are a mirror of one of the ways in which our parents engaged us. For example, I used to avoid my emotions at all costs because it didn't feel safe. Why? Because my dad was very emotionally disconnected. He was very like academic, very intellectual. He was a Western medicine like physician, and everything was kind of like physical world, but anything emotional, anything vulnerable, that wasn't allowed. So what I did as a survival mechanism was I disconnected from my emotions, because that, as a child in relationship to my father, felt safe, right? It wasn't safe to be in my emotions. I had to disconnect from them, right? So I can stay connected to my father, who was caring for my survival. He was putting food on the table, a roof over my head. So I started parenting my own emotions the way my dad parented me. And the healing process on an emotional level is to say, okay, what is the father that maybe I wanted but never received? Can I be that kind of parent to the emotions inside of me right now? Because each emotion is like a little child inside of you crying out for your attention. And it's not crying out to be fixed, it's crying out to be felt and just simply acknowledged.
Now, those emotions, they start moving in sort of a different direction from, let's call fear, anxiety, depression, apathy, lethargy. Once we start changing our belief systems, or once we start acknowledging them or accepting them, does an emotion come from the way you see the world, you perceive the world, and you believe? Let's take, for example, there's been a lot in South Africa now with power and load shedding and stage 6, and there's a lot of people showing a lot of, like I said, emotional vomit. There's a lot of anger out there. Now, is it the way we see that sort of crisis, our belief around that crisis, that, determines our emotions? If we see it as a gift, or we see it as a blessing, like what we've done with our family with load shedding many times before, we had sort of a backup system, but that backup system fails sometimes, is that we play board games and we put candles on and we connect and we chat and we try and see it as a blessing rather than a crisis. It's not easy, and it rolls off the lips very easily. I don't think anywhere in the world, unless you've had power cuts and you realize, how it affects your life. But is it based on a belief foundation that those emotions come?
Yeah, I think all emotions are tied to a belief system. And I mean, the reason people experience anger is in response to something that goes against a belief system or goes against a value. I think values is maybe a better term than belief system. I think our emotions are in relationship to our values. And for example, if someone does something to you that causes you to get angry, it's because they crossed a value or they crossed a boundary. Now, yes, those are based on belief systems. So the emotions are in response to a thought, an idea, a belief, or a value. But also, one thing that's important to acknowledge is whenever an emotion rises up in us, what we think is the cause of it is usually not the actual cause. And the reason that that emotion is rising up in us is it's being asked to be healed. And that emotion is usually related to something much older, something that goes back to your childhood, something that goes back to a trauma or a pain or a wound that you experienced years ago. So whenever you experience an emotion, if you ask yourself, when was the first time I felt this way? Or even how old do I feel when I'm feeling this emotion? For example, I remember coming home from a day of work, and my partner worked a long day, and I live with her and her kids from her previous marriage. So we all lived together as a family. And like the house was a mess. She was super overwhelmed and just like agitated with everything that was going on with the kids. I walked in the door from work, And there were a couple of things around the house that I said I was going to do that I didn't get around to doing yet. And the first thing that I get when I walked in the door from a full day of work was her pointing out and irritated with all the things that I didn't do, all the things that I said I was going to get to, but I didn't get around to. And I noticed this huge burst of anger rise up in me. And I was just like, okay, I need to go take some space and just kind of be present with this emotion. It was like really intense. And I was just being present with that feeling of anger in my body and that energy inside of me. And I was just kind of like sitting with it, just really observing it, witnessing it. And what I started to see was there was this child inside of me who felt ashamed that whatever he did, it was never good enough. Whatever he did, it was never enough. And I checked in with that part of me and I was like, how old does this part of me feel? And it was like 8 years old. Wow. And it was like, whatever I do when I was 8 years old, it was never good enough for my father. However well I performed, whatever grade I got, it was just like never up to his standards. And so I sat with that part of me, I parented that part of me, and I went back in and I realized that all relationships, especially intimate ones, are there to trigger the parts of you that you haven't yet healed in yourself. And in that moment of me walking in the door from my long day of work and my partner triggering my anger and triggering my shame and that big reaction, she was showing me that the 8-year-old inside of me still was wounded, still wasn't healed, still needed some support. And that was just an opportunity for me to really connect with that part of me who I hadn't really connected yet, like up until that point. So the reason I share that story is whatever strong emotion is coming up for you in any given moment, it's usually not related to that experience that you're experiencing right then and there. It's usually related to something much older. Like, for example, a lot of the people right now who are kind of like, you could say, the rebels in the whole, like, let's say, COVID pandemic, you know, like very like anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-Western medicine, which I'm totally on board with all. Like, is it okay that we speak about this kind of stuff? I did not get vaccinated. I'm not a big fan of masks. Like, I'm very much more in favor of really empowering yourself as an individual, taking care of your health and building your own resilience. So I'm definitely not on board with the mainstream narrative by any means. But there is this part of the people on the other side who are very like much, you know, anti-medicine, anti, you know, this, anti that, like conspiracy theorists, like that. It's almost like this inner child that doesn't want to feel controlled by a parent. It's like this inner child that still has unresolved emotions with their father. And archetypally, it's almost like the Western medicine in whole industrial complex like represents like a controlling father figure. And the child inside of them is so turned off by that. There's kind of like that rebellion, there's that anger, there's that, you know, emotional charge. And even though I'm totally on board with like their viewpoints, there still is that emotional charge that's usually related more back to childhood.
That's a reactive, you know, instead of responsive,
yes,
way to actually reach out and express oneself without sort of that inner or that previous child or that young child coming out in such a rebellious way in this instance.
Yes, it's like the child that doesn't want to be controlled by dad and is still very angry with the limitations that he put on their freedom. I think that's still a lot of the charge around some of the people in that camp. Even though I agree with their viewpoints, I don't always agree with the way in which they go about expressing it. It still, like you said, feels very reactive and not very responsive.
It comes from a wounded
So
place.
just another example of how collectively what's coming up for us in this moment is usually stuff that we haven't healed from the past.
Yeah, it's coming from a wounded place instead of a place of healing and wholeness and that. The question is those previous, children or those inner childs that haven't been healed, or, how do we work on that? Do we sit with it? We become aware of it. They are sort of archetypes to a certain degree, but maybe expand on how we deal with this so we don't manifest in a way that's very reactive, that's very abusive, that's very sort of extreme, where the method is a problem. We have a saying, it makes us right. The method is as important as the message, as is important as the moment. So moment, method, and message. So possibly explain a little bit of archetypes and what we do with these wounded sort of children.
Yeah, so we have 4 survival archetypes, which are really the archetypes that come out when we're in that stress response, when we're in that sympathetic fight or flight state, when we're in survival mode. That's why they're called survival archetypes. They're the archetypes that are instilled into you to help you survive. But like we said earlier, not necessarily thrive. So we all have a child. We all have a victim. We all have a saboteur. And we all have a prostitute. Right? The child is the part of us that still looks for some external authority figure to take care of it. It's still looking for a parent figure. It's still outsourcing responsibility, right? The child hasn't yet empowered itself to take full ownership of its life. It's still kind of outsourcing responsibility to others. The victim is the part of us that feels disempowered, that feels victimized, feels almost like life is happening to us rather than for us. The victim also likes to point fingers and blame. The victim likes to go into like self-pity. The saboteur is really self-sabotage, right? The ways in which we self-sabotage. We sabotage our own empowerment. We sabotage our health. We really sabotage our potential and our empowerment for survival purposes, right? And the prostitute would be where we compromise ourselves, where we negotiate ourselves, where we compromise our values. Maybe we say yes to things that we should say no to based on our values, but we do it for security purposes. Maybe we take a job at a company that pays really well, but it goes against our values. Like it would be like me valuing organic food, but Monsanto paying me $5 million a year and me saying yes to that. That would be my prostitute, right? So whenever we're under stress, which the last few years, very stressful for a lot of people, most people, this is where you see the survival archetypes really expressing themselves, right? If you look collectively, even if we use the pandemic as kind of like a framework for these archetypes, the first thing that happens is we're told there's a virus that is killing everybody, and we need to stay home, wear a mask, stay away from loved ones, and kind of like shut down. Like there's the victim archetype. Everyone feels victimized. Like there's this perpetrator coming after them. They're the victim and they need to stay home and protect themselves. Now there's kind of like a sitting and waiting for authority to come and tell you what to do. There's the child archetype that's waiting for mom and dad to give them instructions as to what choice to make. Okay, so we have the victim, we have the child, and then we start to see, you could say, sabotaging certain freedoms, right? We sabotage our own freedom and empowerment for survival and security, right? There's the saboteur. And then throughout this whole process, you see a lot of compromising of values. You see a lot of compromising of values for financial gain, for security purposes. There's, you could say, is the prostitute, even like taking like free handouts, a lot of the prostitutes. So you could see the 4 survival archetypes, and these are not necessarily bad things. They're there for a reason. They're there to ensure your survival when it's under threat. So that is a good thing. For example, if you're in an abusive relationship, to say I'm not a victim would be silly. To deny that you're a victim would be silly. You should say, yeah, I'm a victim and I need to do something about it. I need to get out of this relationship. I need to set stronger boundaries. So they're not all bad. It's just you want to be in relationship with these archetypes in a very empowered way, right? And unfortunately, a lot of times we get our emotional needs met through the disempowered expression of these archetypes. For example, like I shared with you earlier, not feeling a strong emotional connection with my father when I was younger, I said that my father was a physician. He was an orthopedic physician. And as a child, anytime I was in pain or injured in any way, my mom would take me to my dad's office and I would get the best treatment from him, his partners, his nurses, etc. So there was a part of my child's mind that says when I'm in pain, I get more love from dad, or I get more connection with dad. So there's a part of my child archetype and victim archetype that says when I'm the victim, like I'm in pain, I'm injured, or I'm compromised in some way, I get my emotional needs met from my father, right? So that will result in self-sabotage. I might sabotage my health just to get those needs met. So you could see how these 4 archetypes are really at the root of our relationship with our health, our relationship with our emotions and how we try and get our needs met, and our relationship with our own power, where we're willing to sabotage our empowerment just for survival purposes. And that's really what we're being called to shift right now is, really taking full self-responsibility, taking responsibility for our health, taking responsibility for our own happiness, taking responsibility for our own empowerment, for our own emotions, and not outsourcing that anymore. And I think the outsourcing of those things is where we get ourselves into trouble, which the last couple of years you could say is giving us some insight into. So I think that's really the most important point is radical self-responsibility, especially if you take like emotional health, like we were saying, whatever emotion you're experiencing, no one else is the cause of it. It's your experience. And when we can have healthy enough boundaries where we can differentiate self from other and make sure that we're taking responsibility for our emotions and our happiness and not taking responsibility for other people's emotions and other people's happiness, and there's a clear boundary between the two, that's really where we empower ourselves. That's really where we start to heal is that level of self-responsibility. And I think Zach Bush is someone who articulates this beautifully and gives the analogy on a physiological level. For example, the gut being a boundary, right? The gut lining is a boundary between everything that's not you in the gut and everything that's you on the other side of that boundary. So there's a differentiation of self and other when there's that boundary intact. But as soon as that gut permeability starts to show, there's leakiness and there's an inability to differentiate you from the other, right? Because now you have, a piece of beef in your general bloodstream and your immune system doesn't know what's you and what's not you anymore. So there's an inability to differentiate self from others. So I think that's really where his articulation of that really kind of like connects with what we're talking about in terms of the archetypes and really taking responsibility for our own health, our own empowerment, and our own emotions.
Brilliant. And so that would be the overall view about taking that responsibility and just taking the responsibility, like you said, to empower ourselves and not sort of slipping directly into those survival archetypes, which a lot of people do. So would you say almost the definition of someone who's got a high emotional intelligence or high social intelligence is not slipping into those survival archetypes, becoming aware of them, and then moving from a place of thriving and not surviving when they engage in the world?
Yeah. And to heal a lot of those archetypes, the first thing we have to do is really get to know them, understand them, and see the ways in which we've benefited from them. I really love Dr. Richard Schwartz's system of internal family systems. His book, No Bad Parts, is really, really great in terms of working with these different parts of ourselves that are there for a reason. And really, IFS has become very trendy in the last year or two, and rightfully so. It's a phenomenal form of healing work. But what people don't understand is those are really just archetypes that you're working with. He has a system of working with archetypes, which are all the different parts to us. Just like in one body, you have trillions of different cells. In one human being or one self, you have many different selves, many different expressions of ourselves. And they're all kind of like working together to get our needs met. And some of them play like protective roles. Some of them play, other roles. And a lot of those protective roles, like the victim, the saboteur, the prostitute, even like the perfectionist or the people pleaser, like a lot of these roles that we kind of like take on and express and play out, those are not necessarily bad roles or bad parts. They're there for a reason. They're there to protect a younger part of us that feels wounded, that feels vulnerable, and still feels unsafe. So being able to really connect with those parts of us and be present with those parts of us and actually learn how to start parenting those parts of us, that's really where I think the healing starts to take place, is when we learn how to reparent ourselves. A lot of the reasons that we have a hard time with our emotions is our parents had a hard time with those emotions and their parents had a hard time with those emotions. So the ways in which we were parented, we start to parent ourselves in the same way. So one of the first ways I like to heal or work on healing the child archetype is say, okay, how was your child parented? By your mother and by your father. Some positive ways, some negative ways. And the challenging ways in which that child inside of you is parented, how are you parenting yourself in the same way? And then you start to see the connection. You say, okay, well, what did that child inside of you need but never receive? And then you come up with a couple answers and say, okay, that's your responsibility to give that to yourself now.
Powerful.
And, that's a very simple way of working with the child archetype. Another important thing to explore is to ask yourself this question: when my child archetype felt unsafe, or as a child, when I felt unsafe, what was my survival strategy? And how is that still playing itself out nowadays when I go into a stress response?
That's just amazing. It makes me think of, like, I was brought up in a Greek home, Greek immigrants that came here. And then when there was anything disappointing or any failure or any pain, we used to eat. We used to go out and eat. We used to go and, well, now we're going to just like have burgers on a Friday to, or we're going to do this to celebrate. So it was celebration and pain was all related to food. And so that developed a relationship with food. So how would that fit under those archetypes? Because it seems like that was a huge deal in my home growing up, that we would rush to deal with the pain and the suffering and the disappointment with food.
Mm-hmm. So there's two sides to that coin. You said there's food as a means of celebration and food as a means of self-medication.
Yeah.
So what I would say is, to work with that, don't deny yourself that connection to food, but anytime it is a form of self-medication, to, let's say the initial reaction is like, let's go out for some burgers and fries. Let's say it was a challenging day, there was a disappointment, or like, let's order some pizza, or let's, go out for some burgers and fries. To say, okay, well, maybe we'll do that. But before we do that, let's just be fully present with what's coming up for us. Let's just like sit quiet. Let's close our eyes, or let's take out a journal, and let's just kind of like go inwardly and see what wants to rise up. And there's feelings of disappointment. There's feelings of sadness. There's feelings of grief. There's whatever feelings rise up in you, just be fully present with them. Don't try and fix them. Don't try and analyze them. Don't attach a storyline or a narrative to it. Just be present with that energy. And after, I don't know, 5, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, say, okay, what do we want to eat now? So you can then, instead of eating from a place of self-medication, still eat from a place of celebration, but you're celebrating the fact that you engage those emotions.
Wow.
So
do the different archetypes have different ways of dealing with sort of pain and suffering, other than what you stated, what the child does needs to be looked after, and then the saboteur starts self-sabotaging? Are there different sort of patterns which each sort of archetype tries to deal with life?
Yes. So for example, my victim archetype very much likes to shut down. When I feel victimized, I kind of shut down from the world. I have a tendency to go into isolation and kind of like disconnect. There's kind of like an avoidant part of me with the victim archetype whenever I feel victimized. My saboteur can get very caught in kind of like people pleasing, like saying yes to things that I want to say no to, sabotaging myself because I don't want to disappoint somebody. Right. So one of the biggest things to ask these archetypes inside of you is one thing that, in IFS, you ask one of the protector parts, you say, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't play your role? So you ask the saboteur, what are you afraid would happen if we didn't sabotage? And then you notice something that rises up inside of you. And, my prostitute archetype, I remember going back to like when I was 12 years old, my parents would give me some money to go to the movies and to go for ice cream with some friends. And I remember buying my friends movie tickets or like buying their ice cream. And it wasn't my money to spend on them. It was money my parents gave for me to spend on myself. And so I would never have change for my parents. I would say, oh, I got extra snacks, or it was a little bit more expensive this time, or like, but looking back, that was my first memory of the prostitute archetype, which is I was buying their loyalty. Right? That was the prostitute in me that was using money as a means of assuring a guarantee. Right? The prostitute's always looking for a guarantee. Right? Because it doesn't have self-worth or self-esteem. Right? So the prostitute's low self-worth, low self-esteem, which was showing up as a 12-year-old for me, which is I was like this quiet kid. Why do they want to be friends with me? What do I have to offer? Like, so if I buy their movie ticket and buy their ice cream, I think there's a better chance they'll stay friends with me. Right? So there's an example of my prostitute strategy from literally age 12. So you see how these 4 archetypes, these are like formative forces that start very early on, very early on. So that's why, that autonomic nervous system, whenever we shift into that sympathetic state, we go right back to those programs because we're back in survival mode, which brings out the survival archetypes.
Wow. And some of them are nature. I mean, I've got an 18-year-old Greg and I've got a 6-year-old, and we've parented these two very differently. We've gone through a lot of different courses, like I mentioned, from, Lumina, Lemon, Leadership, the Structogram, Icon, the 5 love languages, a lot of these different processes to bring self-awareness and understanding and try and parent in a different way. But as a 6-year-old, is it as simple as accepting and bringing a lot of safety to a child, firstly being the foundation, and then value and significance being the next tier? Because we're trying to put it in a place where Zoe, my daughter, can be herself. She can express her emotions. We can sit with them. We're not trying to fix them the whole time, but she does need to engage in this world. And this world is it's at this stage of her life, what's happened with COVID the last 2 years. I give examples that she used to struggle with the sort of narrative of staying at home and this virus and not being able to process that. And, where is the virus? What is a virus? Why is everyone staying at home? Why are there so many deaths? So give us a little bit of a process with someone that you almost has a blank slate to a certain degree. She is 6. I mean, we have started this as young as possible, but give us a sort of a process that you'd want to put in place with children, or a blank slate if you had one.
Yeah, I think the most important ingredients in terms of working with children, because I don't have my own biological children, but I have, my partner's children, whom I'm, playing very much the dominance kind of like male figure in their life. And one of them has, profound special needs. So it's definitely magnified in terms of how to show up in this way. And the first and foremost is to create a safe space for them to have their experience. And when I say safe space, I don't mean like make sure that they never feel discomfort. I think that's where people get into trouble, is they think, oh, a safe space means there's no discomfort. No. A safe space is a space in which they can safely feel uncomfortable. Right? So whether it's anger, disappointment, sadness, grief, to actually be present with that, to acknowledge their experience, not have to fix it, not have to have a solution for it, but just to be present with them during their process. Right? I think that's the key, is bringing presence to the process, not trying to fix it. Right? So that's number one. And number two, I would say, is I think one of the most important things to bring as a core value and ingredient into relationships with yourself and others, especially children, is curiosity. To get curious about, what is it that we're feeling? And, where do we think that feeling comes from? And where is that feeling in our body? What does that feel like? What is it that we need? What would feel supportive right now? So not bringing solutions, but bringing curiosity and good questions. I love nonviolent communication as a framework of, number one, always being in a state of observation rather than interpretation. Right? Can you stay in a state of observation rather than interpretation? And number two, can you connect to the feeling or emotion that's currently present? Number three, can you connect to the need that's associated with the feeling? If your child is feeling angry, they might need something. If your child is feeling sad, they might need something else. So bringing awareness to the feeling and the need. And then the fourth step is making a request. So one way you can do that within yourself is, oh, I observe myself feeling this way. This is what I need. And then you request that for yourself. Or if it's for a child, I notice you feeling a little bit angry right now. What is it that you need that would feel supportive? And then you put the ball in their court to come up with a solution for themselves. Right? So I think that really empowers the child to, number one, connect to what they're feeling, two, connect to what they need, and number three, decide how they want to get that need met. And you just put the ball in their court by asking a question. And that leads to them, number one, feeling safe, and number two, taking full responsibility for that experience, right? And not blaming anyone else as, the cause of it. And I think, one thing that, I had great parents, but one thing that I struggled with my mother is she was kind of like the helicopter parent, always looking to fix everything. If you're feeling sad, okay, let me take your pain away. If you're feeling disappointment. Okay, how can I alleviate your disappointment? And I think the mother might think that they're doing the right thing at the time, taking their child's pain away, but that's not really giving the child an opportunity to learn how to process their own emotions and to be present with their feelings and the discomfort that's inevitable. It's a natural part of life. And, I remember I was working with this group of women a couple of weeks back, and we were talking about the archetypes. We were talking about the saboteur. And we were talking about really paying attention to how certain things feel in your body. And if saying yes to that thing feels good in your body, then say yes to it. But if saying yes to that thing feels shitty in your body, you're probably supposed to say no to it. But we come up with all sorts of rational reasons why we should say yes. So she was kind of challenging me. She said, well, what about things that feel shitty in your body that you want to say no to, but you have to say yes? So I was like, give me an example. So her daughter is in high school and she's the captain of her volleyball team. And it's a tradition that every year the captain's mother is like the team mom who like does all these things and puts on events and does, is very involved. And she just says, I don't have the energy for it. So I asked her, I said, well, what do you think would be more powerful for your daughter? For you to say yes and sabotage yourself to avoid your daughter's disappointments, or to say no, honor yourself and hold space for her disappointments? What do you think would be in the long run more powerful as a teaching and an experience for your daughter and her future? Well, she said, obviously, saying no, honoring myself. And then when my daughter experiences the disappointment and the sadness or even the anger, to hold space for that and get curious, ask her questions, what's coming up for you? What do you need? What would feel supportive? And just holding space for that process that she's going through. So that's just an example of how a lot of times we try and avoid discomfort or try and avoid our children feeling discomfort, really because it alleviates us of the discomfort of watching their discomfort. And being able to stay present, stay curious, and ask good questions so they can empower themselves.
But that almost comes from a belief of, I believe that if my child is going through discomfort or they're going through pain or going through suffering, that's okay. In fact, that could be very good for them. And I want to support them through it by holding the space, being with them, observing them, staying connected with them. So it's, once again, it seems like what you're doing and what I see with your 21-day holistic program is you teaching people these skills or allowing them to become aware firstly, then allowing them to be possibly become habits and then values that they then live out, because a lot of these things are happening firstly at a parent or adult level and then obviously at a kid's level because no one's got awareness and no one's manifesting these.
Yeah, the program that I designed, Healing the Mind, A Journey to Wholeness, which is a 21-day guided program, is, my intention behind that is, first of all, to take all of the things that I know have worked for me and my clients and just really build a program from my authentic experience. But my intention was to really build people a toolbox. And the toolbox is whenever these situations come up, whenever there's challenges, there's discomfort, there's times of transition, there's a toolbox of tools that you can take out at any given moment and implement to support yourself through the process. And, the first week of the program is really all about getting your body healthy. It's really getting your diet cleaned up, getting you breathing properly, sleeping well, moving well, all the foundational principles. I never like to put the cart before the horse.
I want to stop you there because what I'm hearing is get those physical pillars and bastions in place first, which are fundamental, then mindset, and then tools and archetypes.
Yeah, because, if you're not managing your blood sugar, you're going to have there's no chance in hell you're going to be able to process challenging emotions when you're in a state of low blood sugar, right? Or if your body and your brain are inflamed from, eating processed foods, there's no way that you're going to have the clarity or the space inside of you to feel and process certain things. Or if you're mouth breathing and chest breathing and your simple breathing pattern is keeping you in a fight or flight state, there's no way you're going to be able to make a different choice and not self-sabotage.
So you have to have a certain physical reserve and a sort of physical level before you start wanting to work on the mental or emotional, which you said, which is together, which I love. Actually, I've never thought of it like that, but sort of have the physical first.
Yes, you have to get the body up to baseline health before you can process anything. It's kind of like, the idea of like the stress bucket. If your bucket is already 99% full of all the stressors coming from low blood sugar, poor breathing, sedentary living, too much time on devices, not enough time in nature, not moving your body, not sleeping well, then any sort of disappointment or emotional discomfort is going to tip that bucket over the edge. Where if you can get the body healthy by eating well, sleeping well, moving well, breathing well, then you empty the load in the bucket, and now there's some space inside of it for other things. So that's why week 1 is really just foundational principles.
Yeah.
And then week 2, then we slowly get into different meditation practices, different practices to work with challenging emotions. Like EFT is one of my favorite. EFT, emotional freedom technique, which is the tapping technique. We go through a lot of tapping in the program. We go into the survival archetypes in the program and how to work with our shadow, our inner child, our judgments, a lot of those different principles, how to work with our addictions. So that's week 2. And then week 3, which is really my favorite, is where we start to work with and harmonize our body and our energy with the laws of nature. So working with the 4 elements, working with the 4 seasons, working with the polarities, really understanding that us as human beings, we are an expression of nature. So we have to live according to the laws. So, we take a look at like the elements of earth, air, fire, and water. Someone with anxiety is a lot of air element and they need more earth elements. Someone who's very inflamed is too much fire. They need a little bit more water. Someone who's very depressed could be too much water where they need to cultivate an inner fire. So I teach people how to look at themselves from an elemental standpoint and rebalance themselves in that way. The seasons being, the cyclical nature of things, to really look at yourself and your day and your week and your year as, less linear time, but more cyclical time. Spring being the morning time where you awaken and you prepare, summer being daytime where you take action, autumn or fall being the time of integration, and then winter being, rest and recovery, and really looking at, okay, where am I out of balance in terms of the seasons, and really rebalancing myself in that way. So the 3rd week is taking a look at almost like the alchemical principles of, alchemy and rebalancing, like a lot of, what Chinese medicine does, which is really balancing all of those energetic forces. So, that's the 3-week program in a nutshell. And it's really building and equipping people with a nice toolbox to really empower themselves and rebalance themselves.
And it includes healing the mind and healing the emotions and healing the body to a large degree because they're so interconnected.
Yeah, you can't separate any of that.
Yeah, brilliant.